Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome and thank you very much for being with us today. I am Anne-Sophie, Associate Dean for Pedagogy at HEC Paris, and on behalf of the board, I am very happy to introduce this webinar today. We invited Anne-Sophie Chaxel, Associate Professor of Marketing at HEC Paris, to talk about creating intelligence in the face of uncertainty, a particularly timely topic these days to guide our decision-making. Anne-Sophie, a warm welcome as well, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation to speak in this webinar. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. First, I want to say thank you to HEC for giving me this opportunity to talk to you and share what is my research about, which is really about judgment and decision-making in times of uncertainty. And I also want to thank you for taking the time to actually attend this webinar. So, the way I'm going to do it today is that I'm going to start talking about this topic for about 30 minutes at a pretty, I would say, large scope. And then we'll have 15-20 minutes to actually answer all of the questions that you may have about specific topics. So, the first thing that we have to actually realize in these times of uncertainty is, trying to understand how much uncertainty we are dealing with. So when we think about decision-making under uncertainty, there are several scenarios that we can think of. There is the traditional scenario of having very low uncertainty. Low levels of uncertainty are usually defined with data that we can easily use to actually predict the future, right? So we can predict the future based on what we know from the past. Sometimes we are dealing with moderate level of uncertainty. It means that there are several possible futures and that we can potentially ascribe probabilities to each of those futures. And then there are scenarios that, scenarios where that are so hard to actually define, that we are dealing with, very high, severe uncertainty, that it's impossible to come up with options. It's impossible to ascribe probabilities to these different options. And options are going basically in all potential directions. So, pretty simple question to start this this webinar about sizing up uncertainty. I'm going to start with a little poll to get a gauge of your feelings about the situation as we face it today. So not 6 weeks ago, not 2 months ago, like today, like in France, we are going out of this, we are reopening a little bit, right? And I would like to have your own understanding of how much uncertainty we are dealing with right now. So I'm going to launch this poll. You can vote if you are attending this this webinar with a link. If you're on YouTube, you cannot actually vote. But the idea is, so how much, the question is, how much uncertainty are we facing in our lives as of today? And the first option is back to relatively low. We can predict a lot based on past data. The second option is truly average. We can identify a few paths forward with some good probabilities. Severe, it's hard to identify any reliable path forward. And then I don't know, I'm taking the webinar to actually know. All right, we still have, we have 70% voting at the moment. I'm going to wait for the numbers to go a little bit higher. All right, well, almost everybody, 80%. Okay. So I'll share the results with you. They are more split than what I would have thought originally, but this is kind of, I was debating giving you this poll. I thought this is like I think you know, but I'm going to take the position today that we are actually dealing with severe uncertainty. So we have 59% of people saying it's severe. We have 38% saying it's average. We can identify some path forward. For the people who said average, let's reassess. Maybe let's reassess at the end of the webinar whether maybe I changed your mind. But I do think that we are dealing with a very high level of uncertainty. So I actually think that it's such severe uncertainty that it's actually too hard for one single person to fully comprehend this crisis. Right? So it's always very, very hard to know what we don't know. Right? It's very comfortable to rely on the information that we have and try to see potential futures based on what we know. But the fact is here that we have first to understand the crisis to unhide what we do not know. And that's very hard. I'll put some of the things that we don't know, and it's not even an exhaustive list here. So first, we know very little about the virus itself, right? So it's a coronavirus, right? But besides that, I mean, we're starting to build knowledge, but we know actually very little about the virus itself, right? So the coronavirus is, it's not as if before this crisis, we had thousands of scientists in the world, actually working on coronaviruses, right? You do not necessarily build an academic career on researching coronavirus. A little bit more since the MERS and SARS, but very, very little known actually on the virus itself. We know as well very little about the symptoms. I mean, obviously we know more and more. Every day we know more and more. But there's still a lot of unknowns, right? Can kids contaminate other people, right? To which extent? What's the mortality rate? In terms of symptoms, is it only the lungs? Is it as well the brain? Why are some people not infected? Can we have a virus several times, right? We're going to talk today about those numbers that are extremely uncertain. I'm not saying we don't have numbers. I'm just saying that the numbers that we have a great deal of uncertainty ascribed to them. We know very little as well about the story of the virus. And it's important to know the origin of the virus because it's going to impact, for instance, the contagiosity rate, the mortality rate, and how fast the virus has been developing in countries. We know as well not that much yet from research, right? So research is a very long process, and we hope to have answers provided by the scientific community, right, by academia. But it's actually very hard to have reliable data even from researchers at the moment. Why? Because we need to collect this data, we need to run the experiments, we need to analyze the results, and we need to have scientific reliable samples that we can compare to control groups. And so the knowledge that we get from the scientific community is not as reliable as we would like it to be right now, right? On top of that, because the pipelines to actually develop research, like there's so much research right now on the topic, and the way that research can be published right now, it's really a lot of open science. So a lot of people can actually put their papers online without having necessarily a peer review, and it adds up, right, to the uncertainty around the knowledge that we have about the virus. We have as well a lot of uncertainty in the information that's given to us, right? So I will talk about conspiracy theories later, but clearly making the distinction between what's a fact, right? Scientific fact, meaning this is based on scientific knowledge, and what I'm going to call sometimes pseudo-scientific knowledge. So it's knowledge that it seems scientific, it sounds scientific, but we do not have reliable evidence for it. It adds up as well to this uncertainty around all the data that we have. lots of uncertainty as well about how governments, right, are going to react in the next months, in the next semesters, and how these reactions all over the globe, right, are going to interact with each other. So when you put all of that together, and I could have kept on going on this slide, honestly, with everything we do not know, I thought I would stop there, trying to really sizing up all of this uncertainty that we have to deal with right now. And, that was the world as we knew it before, nice, predictable, data-based, and hopefully, it would be looking as beautiful as this little graph. And what I'm telling you is that we are dealing with severe uncertainty, but you're right, for all of you who have said moderate uncertainty, we are seeing a lot of analysis done with decision trees, right? And at the beginning, the decision trees, we're looking something like that, like option 1, there is very little disruption. Option 2, especially in France, right? Because at first we started with two weeks increment of lockdown, we'll be back to normal in 4 weeks, right? Option 3 will be back to normal at the end of the lockdown, worst case scenario, 8 weeks, right? Something like that, not exactly that. And then as we were going into the lockdown, it kind of changed a little bit. We kind of grasp the reality a little bit more. And we had, back to normal in September, back to normal in January. And I think now it's that, right? It's more and more back to normal in January, and then in 1 year, and with a vaccine, we'll be actually back to normal. But the problem of these decision trees is that they make you wait, right? Because we are waiting to be back to normal, right? We are waiting to be back to a situation that we can control. Right? And so I'm going to talk about that in this seminar, the fact that we want so much certainty that we are ready to wait, right, for situation to be back to normal. But what I'm going to tell you is that you should not be waiting. You should be making decisions right now. And I'm going to try to give you, a very large framework to make decisions. So that's our new normal. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, with several things that can happen and that you have to deal with. And what the first thing that I want to say is that there is this idea of delay between the realization, becoming aware of how much uncertainty we are dealing with, right? So at the very beginning of the crisis, we were hoping, that it would be relatively manageable, and then we went towards decision trees, and then now more and more, and I mean the poll is showing it, like most of you, close to 60%, actually agreeing on the fact that it's a severe uncertainty. But there was a delay. There was a delay because it's a very low probability event. So I'll talk about at the end the bias, right? The hindsight bias that makes us think after the fact that everything was predictable. To a large extent, this crisis was not predictable. But what was much more doable was to react much faster to the crisis, and we did not react for a very single, very, very precise bias that we show quite often in our decision making, which is the wishful thinking bias, right? This is this idea that we tend to be overly optimistic, right? So I like this quote that a severe depression like that of 1920, 1921, right, is outside the range of possibilities, of probabilities. And that was in November 1929. Right. So this is this idea that it's very, very hard to predict events that are not desirable. We don't want them to happen. And so we have this tendency to see desirable events as more likely to happen and undesirable events as less likely to happen. So not only we were dealing with an event that was a very low probability event, but on top of that, we were even more likely to think it was not going to happen because we didn't want it to happen. This is what we call in research motivated reasoning, right? And you know, it's a bias we know pretty well in research. We know that from, you know, sports. We are all likely to think that our favorite team is most likely to win. This is an event that we know, a type of bias that we know as well from patriotism. And for instance, here I'm thinking financial decision making and patriotism. If you ask investors, you know, whether their investments are going to go up or down, and in which, what's the likelihood, investors in the US are saying the US is going to go up much more than what it will actually be. And if you ask the same thing in Japan, the study was designed like that, same thing. Japanese were actually more likely to believe that their investments would go up. It's a bias as well that we know very well from politics and voting, and the fact that you're less likely to go voting for your own, right? You're more likely to stay at home because you believe you don't need to go vote, because in any case, your political party is going to win, right? That's a bias that we saw with medication linked to the coronavirus. It does not mean that a specific medication is not going to work. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that our perception that it's going to actually be working is higher than what it should be, right? And this is why, as well, at the beginning, we were thinking that the coronavirus would be a flu, right? So it's this idea today of trying in this webinar to try to assess, you know, how can we deal with that much uncertainty, right? Can we do something to manage it? And I'm going to say that the idea is that uncertainty is going nowhere, right? We are going to have to deal with this uncertainty for the foreseeable future. And we need to learn to live with it. And I'm going to try to give you a framework to live with this uncertainty. So the first thing that we have to deal with is uncertainty is in our data. This is a major issue in decision making because most good decisions rely on good data. Right? So the first thing, again, is going to really be able to sizing up and understand that your data in itself are uncertain. So I'm going to say here that there are 3 sources of uncertainty that you have to recognize, right? Separately. The first thing is that you're going to have uncertainty in the data that you get. The second thing is that you're going to have uncertainty in how you interpret those data and how you make estimations. And then the third thing is that, you know, the estimates that are given to you by experts right now are uncertain as well, right? Okay. So let's go through these 3 sources of uncertainty and the biases that can happen each time. And then I'll give you a framework for data gathering to actually try to manage and reduce uncertainty. All right. Before going into that, I would like to do a little exercise with you to actually make what I'm going to tell you more concrete. You have a question on your screen, which is, what is the highest body temperature ever recorded? Not in France, on Earth, right? Ever. Okay. I just want you to have a little estimation in your head. That's it, just one. Okay. And I'll give you the answer at the end, right? So, but just do this little estimate. So one of the things that we do when we have data that's uncertain is that we tend to misweight it. We tend to ascribe too much weight to information that is available in front of us. So given to us by others, but as well information that is mentally accessible for us. When we try to access knowledge, we call that, we have mental models, right, for information. We are, when we are asked a question, we are going to retrieve this knowledge. So in my body temperature question just before, you might have started retrieving information about your own fevers, right? Okay. So, you know, at the beginning of a crisis, in the Western world, when we have been told there was a new virus, what information did we retrieve? Well, we retrieved information related to other viruses that we know, and we've done our best, right? We've retrieved information on the flu, for instance, which made us put too much weight on this information that we had and not considering all the unknowns that we had about this virus, right? And then so we skewed our judgment towards this information that we had, but that was not necessarily the most reliable for taking decisions here. You've seen that in Asian countries, because they had to deal with the MERS, with SARS, the reactions were slightly different. They had already a mental model for viruses and crises. So that was at the beginning of a crisis. Now we have an entire different mental model for this virus, right? We have all been hooked to the media, right? We have all been hooked at these numbers. They seem like they're giving us a sense of certainty, right? In this uncertain world. But they don't tell us much about what we can do with these. How can we go forward, right, based on those numbers? But what the media frenzy has created is fear, right? And so, you know, maybe during the questions at some point, maybe we will talk about nudges and things like that. Maybe we'll have questions about that, but. You know, I am I'm not very worried about people not wearing their mask, right? I am more worried at this time about people who do not want to go out of their home, right? Because we are living in a risky world, right? So it's a completely different type of mental models that we have now. So that's the first source of uncertainty in your data. The second source is yourself, and you have to realize that. My little example that I had earlier, what is the highest body temperature ever recorded? You know, you had your estimates. I would like you to try to construct a confidence interval for that. Confidence interval is just that, you know, you're going to tell me, let's say your estimate is 42. You're going to say, I'm 95% sure that the correct answer is between 41 and 44. Okay, you just do it for yourself right now. And it is true that building confidence interval is very important to actually, you know, emphasize uncertainty. You've made an estimate, it's not perfect, you know, you build your confidence interval around that. I'm going to tell you that it's not enough to build the confidence interval, because when you are constructing your confidence interval, you are still overconfident. So the idea of overconfidence in research is exactly about that. It's the idea that your meta-knowledge, so the information, what you think you know about what you know, right? So we are one level up from what you know, from your primary knowledge. Your meta-knowledge is skewed as well. So we usually think we know more than what we actually know, right? This is the definition of overconfidence, right? And so, you know, in my example, the body temperature, nobody really cares. This is the primary knowledge is not important, but the confidence interval that you've just constructed is very important because it says a lot about you, right? If you have actually built a small confidence interval and you have no idea about the answer, you are overconfident. Now, if you build a confidence interval between you know, 37 and 60 degrees, you are way underconfident, right? So the idea is trying to calibrate this confidence interval so that it can actually build, you can actually have the actual solution, the actual real estimate in your confidence interval. Right. So that's very, very important because if you know that your primary knowledge is lacking, like potentially your body temperature, you're going to keep looking for information. Right? You might go into Google, you might actually ask a doctor, but when you don't know that you don't know, you stop gathering information. And this is where your decisions become very much biased because you think you have the correct data when actually you do not have the correct data. Okay. That's the standard, by the way, good students having good grades, but always telling you they had it wrong. You know, it's just that they know where they got it wrong, right? So, but you always have the best students having no idea, right? Oh, I aced the tests. It's just because they don't know what they had wrong, right? It's the same idea, so they are way overconfident. And you know, to make a transition to the fact that even experts can be biased, you know, there is a lot of research on overconfidence for doctors. And I know that we have some doctors listening today. And so that's the idea that the doctors have excellent primary knowledge. They know very, very well the symptoms for diseases, and they are used to make the correct decisions. Most of the time, they make the correct decisions. And so they do not necessarily have, you know, the feedback to actually build good confidence interval because usually they are correct. But when you have a very hard medical decisions to make, sometimes they can be overconfident, right? Because they would not retrieve information that would go against the diagnostic that they have just made. All right. And then, so the last source of uncertainty is really others, and the fact that even experts sometimes can be overconfident, and so even their estimations sometimes can be, you know, the confidence interval can actually be miscalibrated. So that's a little study that the University of Massachusetts Amherst did. And they asked a survey of experts mid-April to estimate the number of deaths in the US on May 1st, right? So 2 weeks after. I'm not even trying to predict what's going to happen in 6 months. We're going to try to predict what's going to happen 2 weeks, right? And we're actually asking experts. And so on the right, if you you can look on the right of your screen, you have all of the estimates by the experts. And the actual number of deaths, by the way, was 65,000. So this is what you see at the top of your screen for this little study. So the best estimates, right? And the confidence interval. And you have all of the confidence interval provided by experts at the bottom. And what you can see at the very bottom, you have the expert consensus, right, in orange. And what you can see is that the expert consensus was 47,000 deaths by May 1st, right? The estimate, even if you take the general average, the estimate is still too much down, right? The confidence interval is actually all right, right? If you take everything, right, in terms of expert consensus. When you look at each single expert, something like more than half were actually really wrong, right? So let's say 1/3 where it didn't even have a confidence interval, right? Didn't even have 65,000 in the confidence interval. And then you had as well, most of them were actually too much down. So this is where really, you know, even when you look at data provided by experts, always be very careful about the data you get. Never accept those data in blind faith. Ask several experts, never only one expert that's the most confident, right? Because again, it can lead to overconfidence. Seek experts that disagree, right? Because you might actually be able to build a better confidence interval by thinking about all the reasons why your estimate is wrong, right? And obviously consider the source. Sometimes no knowledge is better than a nonsense knowledge, right? Because a nonsense knowledge is going to make you stop gathering information, make you take a decision right away, while no knowledge, at least you know usually that you have no knowledge. All right. So, you know, really seize this uncertainty in your data, in yourself, in others. Question whether the information that you have is useful. Consider multiple sources of estimates, not only one. Question your overconfidence. Seek feedback on your confidence interval. Like the only people who have very good calibrated confidence intervals, believe it or not, are people who are predicting the weather, right? So research has shown that they have a very, very good confidence interval. The reason is they get continuous feedback, right, about what they predict. All right. So that's for the first source, right, of the first step in that. And just if you're curious, the highest body temperature ever recorded is about 46 degrees. Right? So if you have a confidence interval that includes that, great for you. If not, you were a little bit overconfident. Okay. So the second step, and this is really where all of my research is about, it's about biases when we interpret information. So, you can have bias in your data, but then the way we interpret ambiguous information can as well be very, very biased. So, there's three things again that I'm going to talk about here, and the first is that when everything else is uncertain, we really want our belief to be certain, right? So it's kind of this idea of I know what I know. So everything else in the world, in the external world, is ambiguous, uncertain. But my beliefs, what I knew, what I've known, is actually correct. It's certain, right? And that's really our brain under uncertainty, is that we freeze. We literally freeze these mental models that I was talking about, right? So our brains on uncertainty is really freezing. It's wanting to regain control as well on everything. So we are freezing our opinions, and it has all sorts of consequences on our decision making. And I'm happy to take any questions here on that, because I've spent 15 years of my life really, studying those biases on information evaluation. It makes us develop stronger opinion. It makes us less creative in times where we actually need very strongly to be creative. It leads to more stereotyping, and it leads to more polarization of opinions, right? So in a time when we actually need to work together and be collaborative, we have this tendency to actually do the opposite. And then the second thing is that we tend to want to regain control on our world, and we are looking for cues that the world is not random, right? And this is where you have conspiracy theories coming, right? So conspiracy theories, you remember this little graph that I had at the beginning of the webinar. This is a beautiful, predictable world, right? In which small cause means a small consequence, right? X and Y. And a large cause means a large consequence. Coronavirus conspiracy theories are all about that, right? We have very large consequences of this crisis. And our brain wants us to think that it got to have had a large cause, right? It's very difficult to think that a random event could have happened and triggered all of those issues. And so we crave to regain control on what's not controllable. And what I'm going to tell you is that try to regain control Being in an uncontrollable environment is very stressful. I can talk about emotions and decision making if you want in the questions, but it is very stressful. And so we need to regain this sense of control, but let's try to regain it where we actually can regain it, right? So following a precise exercise routine, having a schedule in our day, cooking is perfect. We have all the steps. Right, and then suddenly we have hopefully the predicted outcome. Right, so this is very good. Unfortunately, one element that is not as good is that it makes us crave leaders that show control. Right, and the prime here of leadership is that, and I'll talk about that in 2 minutes, is that it is very difficult to make long-term plan. I'm going to say, do plan, but short term, and be very flexible, right? So this is a little bit of a danger in the next few months. So try to regain control where you can control in your life and in your decision making. You have here the 3 main reasons that determine that leads to good outcome. You have the implementation, whether you followed your strategy, all of the variables that you can actually control, which is the decision-making process. And this is what we do today in this webinar. And then all the uncontrollable factor, everything that's left to chance that you should not try to regain control of. Right? This is a large bias that we want to control chance. We can't here. We just have to acknowledge it. Right? So challenge the status quo, try to keep flexible. Remember, we tend to freeze automatically. Let's not do that. Let's be adaptive, flexible, adapt. Let's adapt the plans. Regain control in controllable domain of your life and controllable element of the decision-making process. And then the fact that we have so much uncertainty in these uncontrollable factors, right? It's really chance. Well, expect that the plan is not going to follow the plan. And that's okay. That's okay. If everything else is under control, you followed the right decision-making process, you've done your best for controlling implementation, it is okay that things are going to happen right now in the environment that you could not control. Right. So more on that in this third part, which is really on how can I learn when I make a decision and there is so much that is left to uncertainty, right? So if I make a decision, how do I know it's a good decision, right? So with this little quote from Jack Welch saying an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive business advantage. And here, I'm telling you, do not wait. Have plans, even though they are not perfect, and have very fast, very short feedback loop, right, that allow you to actually learn from what you've done. So these 3 things here. So how do you learn from experience? How do you get this feedback to actually, can you get this feedback to actually make better decision in the future? And how can you create a path forward? So here, the number 1 distinction I want you to remember from today is that experience is not learning. So here, you're not going to be really able to learn so much from the outcome. The outcome is the experience in itself. The learning, on the opposite, really comes from a good understanding of the causes, right, of the outcome. So you need to be able to link cause and outcome. And the very difficult thing in that, I'll talk about 2 little biases that we can have when we try to learn from experience, especially under uncertainty. But you know, the one thing here is that to change the game in an uncertain environment, you do not need a game-changing solution, right? You don't have to wait for this all or nothing solution. Well, we'll find the perfect solution. Your solution is not going to be perfect in the sense that there's a lot of things you cannot control, but you need to learn what's going to work and not work in practice. So it means short feedback loop in which you're going to take small steps, learn from it, and adapt and stay flexible, right? And just this little analogy with medicine here. Well, we are all waiting for a vaccine, and yes, it will be a game changer at the end, but a lot of little small steps. We're not all waiting just for a vaccine, right? We're not in medicine, that's not what they are doing. They also come up with short-term solution and they are learning from it, right? Experimentally. So learning, for instance, when it's the best time to intubate a patient, right? This is important too, right now, when we know so little about the virus, right? So this needs constant updating. It needs those very short feedback loop. And the difficulty of that is that the impossibility of making long-term promises is very hard to sell, right? And this is the main issue that leaders are facing right now. And I am happy as well to discuss that in questions. If there are some questions about leadership and what should you say when it's very difficult to communicate. So, you know, when we assess, when we try to make this link between the cause of something and the outcome, you know, that's the same framework that I've just presented before. There's all this luck, the uncontrollable elements, and there's this skill, right, that's coming from the decision process, the implementation process. I just want to pinpoint two big biases that we show in that. First, we love to think that when we are successful, right, it's all because of skill, right? But if we fail, it's all because of luck, right? It's very difficult to learn from experience if you think like that, because everything that you did wrong was because of luck. What's super interesting with this bias that we call the attribution bias is that we do the exact opposite for other people, right? So if other people fail, it's because of skill, right? And if other people succeed, it was luck. Right? So just be aware of it. Try to actually have a good decision-making process. We actually decide in advance what is going to be these uncontrollable elements, controllable elements, and assign the right responsibility. And then there is the insight bias as well, but I introduced the talk with it. Like, it's all so easy after the fact to actually analyze what happened, right? So the insight bias occurs when we think that an event that was not predictable becomes predictable. So that's the situation that leaders had to face in December, January, right? At the beginning, it was very difficult to predict. As you know, when information came up from China, they should have, you know, reacted. But it's very difficult after the fact. So how do you avoid, you know, this after the fact type of bias? The best thing I can say: run a pre-mortem, not a post-mortem. Post-mortem means that you analyze your decision after the fact, you know, when you see what happened and you try to have a causal relationship. Do it before. When you make a decision, try to tell yourself, okay, we failed. You know, in 1 year from now, we actually failed. And try to be with your team and analyze all of the reasons why you failed in advance, right? And you're going to, when you think like that, you're going to start to be able to distinguish what's controllable and not controllable. So that's it, really, in terms of this third part, which is really building certain knowledge fast, between being able to make the distinction between experience and learning, having this short feedback loop, and to try to use pre-mortem to actually build a path forward. So that's for the general framework to regain, right, to manage and reduce uncertainty. So first, you respect it. Second, you expand. You try to keep your mental models flexible. You try to avoid this freezing that I talked about. and then you try to build certain knowledge fast. And the one thing I want to say to conclude this talk is that, you know, this is a virus that's impacting our bodies, clearly. But it's as well impacting the uncertainty that's linked to the virus is as well impacting our brains and how we think. And the good thing is that there is a whole lot we know about how uncertainty works and how it impacts how we think and how we behave. And I think in that we can try to predict a little bit and make better decisions. All right, so that's just for a summary slide of what I said, but I'm sure there's a lot of questions behind. And so I think I'm going to let Anne summarize a few of those.
Yes, thank you very much, Anne-Sophie, for this talk. Actually, you're right, there are many questions, so I'm sorry, probably what I tried doing in the past minutes is to summarize some of them and to group them together. I'm sorry in advance if we don't take all your questions. Nevertheless, Anne-Sophie, I think we can start with a couple of questions that have to do with leadership issues. And there are lots of questions that ask basically how a manager should behave with his team in the time of uncertainty. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this part.
Yeah, so I think one of the questions is, I mean, one of the very difficult part of leading is that a lot of employees want certainty. And that's what I've said during this talk, right? People want certainty. And as leaders, we do not have all of the answers right now. So when you think about how you communicate, usually in the way we communicate, we talk about the what should we be doing, right? And the how. So how should we actually do this? Right? This is okay for a traditional answer. I think it's a little bit, you know, I think it can be improved in terms of in times of uncertainty. Let me try to give you an example for that. Let's imagine your boss is telling you you need to do some work right now, right? And you're at home with your family, but maybe you have kids behind, and it's extra work that you would not necessarily think of doing. As the employee, what's your first question? Is it, you know, what is it required of me? What should I be doing? How should I be doing that? No, it's like, why are they asking me that? Right? And so I think in times of uncertainty, more than the what and the how, you really have to be very careful to actually talk about the why you're asking something, right? Because this is what's going to motivate your team. It's the why should always be there, but in uncertain time, it's even more important to actually communicate on that, right? So if you have the why, then you're at least still going to have a motivation, and then you can actually have the what and the how. The other thing I would say as well is do not hesitate to share your process, right, when with your teams. It's like show all of the potential action items that you could have taken, right? And explain why you've chosen this one, right? Again, back to this why are we doing that? Just because there is a lot of reactance right now from teams. We are asking a lot, right? We're asking a lot in times that are where people are very sensitive, they are very anxious, and so they are more likely to show reactance to new ideas, right? So why do we change? So I think communicating about this why is very important.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Sophie. So now I'll switch to some questions that are related to the emotional states that uncertainty brings us towards. And in particular, there were a couple of questions about the fact that uncertainty creates irritation, potentially frustration, basically emotional exhaustion, and how to deal with this and how, as supposedly, it biases our decision-making. of course.
Okay. So, it's true that at an individual perspective, everybody is dealing right now with a lot of anxiety. And the worst thing you can do with anxiety, it's like uncertainty, right? It's to try to tell to yourself that you should not be anxious. Right? There is an experiment a long time ago that has been run about asking participants not to think about polar bears. I could tell you right now, do not think about polar bears. And the first thing you're going to do is to think about polar bears, right? And same thing with anxiety. If I'm telling you, do not be anxious, the first thing that you're going to, it's even worse, right? Because we are stressing now about controlling our emotions. So the first thing, like here, I told you respect the uncertainty first. I'd say respect your own anxiety, right? Label it. There's several ways to deal with anxiety, but first labeling it and then finding ways as well to replenish, right? So try to understand again when are you the most anxious, right? What is triggering anxiety in your life, so you can try to mitigate that as much as possible. And so there's as well the fact that if you label it and you try to mitigate as much as possible what's really the triggering elements, one of the things that research has shown to mitigate anxiety is really to be present-minded, right? So call it mindfulness if you want, call it meditation for some others, but it's really taking this time not to think about the past, not thinking about the future, but really being in the present. And that can relieve anxiety as well. But yes, I mean, any decision making under uncertainty is full of affect. And it's important as much as possible to monitor that.
Yes, thank you. And very related to this, there was something about whether emotional intelligence would be a skill important in this kind of uncertainty environment. But I guess we can relate to you.
Absolutely. It's part of that, right? So controlling your own emotion, right, in a healthy way is actually critical. Here. So yes, there are both aspects to it. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. And then there were several questions about relying on data, and particularly the idea that when there is uncertainty, it's actually pretty hard to find what data to use and which data to bring into modeling, algorithms, etc. And then there was the question, data science has a limited use in this situation. Do you agree or not?
All right, so okay, there's several questions here. So the first is about the reliability of the data that we see. And so this is what I was telling you at the beginning, like to trust the data that you see, you have first to be really careful to check whether the people who are sharing this data are actually open to share how they collected the data. Right? So it means being very transparent about the process and explaining how the data has been collected and analyzed. Right? So if this is a black box, this is a large issue. The second thing is that look as well at whether the decision makers are making a responsible use of the data. So if you have a use of data that breaches, for instance, privacy, be very careful about that, because it does say something about the source of the data and whether people care about following the right process, right? And then, you know, like check as well clearly the credibility of the source in general. And so there was the second question was more about data modeling. So at the beginning of the crisis, data modeling models, you know, a model is based on the assumptions, right? So it's based on what you put into the model. So it's based on the data you actually use to create your model. So you're back to basics, back at the beginning of my talk. What do you feed the model with, right? And so at the very beginning, we didn't have that. Even the best models have confidence intervals as well, right? So we are estimating slopes. So you have the exact same issues that I've talked about. It doesn't mean that I don't believe in data science. Actually, I'm a very strong proponent of data science, but at the beginning and even now, right, there's so much uncertainty in the data that experiments are usually have been, you know, commonly used, right? So you have a control group, you try to change something in another group, and then you see if it works, right? So it allows to go a little bit faster and to build those this certain knowledge, what I've talked about in the last part, right? Trying to build certain knowledge. Once you have this certain knowledge, when you have more information coming in, the data obviously are going to be a very large part of the answer. Right? So in the next few months, we are going to have models that are more and more accurate. Right? So it's not an all or none answer to this question. It just means that at the beginning, they were not perfect. They are getting more and more refined. And hopefully, once they'll be fed with good, reliable data, we'll be able to predict the future a bit better.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne-Sophie, for these answers. We have very short time left. Maybe I close it with one quick question that was raised also in different manners in the panel. But basically, some people are wondering, okay, how to balance between a natural, optimistic, and severe uncertainty environment. So
that's a good question. It's not an easy question. I think again, like when you're back to one of my first slides, it's easy at the beginning to only recollect positive information. It's easy now, all right, to fall into the opposite pattern, right, and only see the negative information. So again, it really depends. I mean, depends what decision you have in mind, but to really rely on the data that you think you need for this decision. So I don't know if your question is more about life in general and do we need to be pessimistic or optimistic, but let's say that you need to assess, you know, a risk. Just look at what type of information you actually need, build your confidence interval and see, and really try to see whether you need to be, you know, overall it's an optimistic outcome or a pessimistic outcome, right? But I cannot give generality overall. So it's going to really depend on the decision that you will have to take.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne-Sophie. We're not going to keep you longer. I'm sorry, there were many questions. Well, I hope I had the opportunity to cover many of them by summarizing, and you relate to your question in the answers that have been given. Anne-Sophie, thank you very much for your participation in this webinar, and hope to see you all soon in the next HEC webinars. Thank you very much, and goodbye to all.